Well, hello everybody. My name is Roger and welcome to my channel, Rogers Reads. So today I'm doing my July wrap-up and I decided to break it into 3 parts. I think I read about 13 books this month. And so I decided to break it up into smaller videos rather than do the whole thing at once. So the first book I read in July was Bruja Born by Zoraida Cordova. I saw this at the library and it caught my attention, so I decided to pick it up. I had no idea actually that this book was the second in the series until after I finished the book. So that being said, Bruja Born can be read alone, though you might want to start with the first one, which is called Labyrinth Lost. And this is actually, these books are actually part of the Brooklyn Bruja series. So this book follows Lula, and the story is told from her point of view. I believe that Labyrinth Lost was told from the point of view of her sister. Now what's fun is that I had no idea what this book was about going in, so I was pleasantly surprised. So this follows Lula Mortiz, a bruja and a healer, and her family of witches or brujas. If my high school Spanish serves me, I do believe that bruja is the Spanish word for witch. Although I do remember at one point in the book, they did make a distinction between bruja and witches, that they're not the same thing, or at least they aren't in this world. So we get the idea right off that Lula is scarred emotionally and physically by the events that took place in the first book. In so doing, she ends up pushing people away, especially her boyfriend Max, which is spelled M-A-K-S. But there's a bus crash that kills everybody on the bus except for her and Max, though he is in critical condition. Now, though Lula is a healer, she's unable to heal Max, and she actually asked the Bruja High Council for help, but they refused her. So, along with her sister, she casts a healing spell in an effort to cheat death and bring Max back. But the magic that they use defies the laws of the Dios, or the gods, and it's considered both dangerous and forbidden. So, needless to say, things go horribly wrong. So, the spell does end up bringing back Max, but he's not the same boy he knew. He's different. He's wrong. This kind of reminded me of that episode in Buffy the Vampire Slayer where Buffy came back from the dead and Spike, the vampire, said something to the effect of, "You came back wrong, Slayer, you came back wrong." But anyway, I digress. So as we later learn, Max is in fact quite different, and he's actually a casi muerto, which means, I got the impression it means like half dead or quasi-dead. But that's not all. As it turns out, he's not the only one she ended up bringing back from the dead, and of course chaos ensues. Now, the goddess of death, Lady de la Muerte, who is quite scary, by the way, is pretty much forcing Lula to fix her mistake. But in order to do so, there's a very high price that needs to be paid. Of course, there always is. And perhaps it's the ultimate price. And now it's a race against the clock to eliminate the disaster that Lula has created. So that's all I can really say about this without giving anything else away. But let me say that this is quite a fast-paced thrill ride, and at times it's quite harrowing. I ended up loving the Mortiz sisters. They're all well-developed, empowered, and badasses. Great character development, especially with Lula, which isn't surprising since the book kind of revolves around her and is told from her point of view. She was powerful, fierce, determined, and took complete responsibility for the consequences of her actions. And she really ended up growing as a character by the end of the book. And the storyline kept me on edge right until the very end. There's also a really strong message about the power of family, which really resonated with me. So I ended up loving this story and the magical world that this author created. And I definitely plan on reading the other books in this series. I don't know how many there are, but I know there's at least one more before this. So I ended up giving this book 4.5 stars. So the second book I read was Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. So I read this as part of my Harry Potter read-along, in which I went through 2 or 3 chapters of the book every week and discussed it in a video. And it's in my Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone playlist if you want to check it out further. But there's no sense in talking about the plot, as I'm sure most, if not all of you, know the story. But it was a lot of fun rereading this, as it's been many years since I've done so. There were a lot of things I missed the first time, now that I knew the whole story, and I could see a lot of foreshadowing of things that were to come. So it was kind of fun rereading it. I'll probably will continue rereading the rest of the series. Not sure when, though. So the third book I read in July was entitled The 5 Stages of Andrew Brawley, written by Sean David Hutchinson. So the story follows 17-year-old Andrew Brawley, a survivor of a terrible car accident that killed his parents and younger sister. He's tormented and pretty much consumed by survivor's guilt, as he blames himself for the accident. Now, he has also never left the hospital where his family died, and now lives there permanently, though nobody in the hospital knows it. But death was late for coming for him that night of the accident, and now he tries to escape her and not catch her attention while living in the hospital and pretending to be one of the staff. So Andrew pours all of his grief and guilt into a project which he calls Patient F, which is the subject of a graphic novel he's writing. The author gives us a glimpse of the graphic novel between the chapters, which we figure out pretty quickly is a symbolic telling of Andrew's dark and troubled psyche. So here's a... So the graphic novel is usually shown in the beginning of each chapter. So, yeah, and it's actually quite a fun addition to the story. So back to Andrew. So Andrew goes about his day working in the cafeteria. The cafeteria manager actually pays him in cash, chatting with the nurses, and visiting 2 patients in the cancer ward whom he ends up befriending. Their names are Alexi and Trevor. And at night, he returns to his home, which is a forgotten room or area in part of the hospital where nobody goes anymore. It might be an unfinished wing. I'm not sure if they really said what it was. But all the while, he's evading this woman that he refers to as Death, and whom Drew is positive is looking for him. But everything changes one night when a boy his age named Rusty arrives in the ER, the apparent victim of a hate crime, badly burned over much of his body. So Andrew begins visiting him late at night, reading first from his own comic, Patient F, which graphic novel that I talked about, and then from novels later lent to him by the cafeteria manager. But now that Rusty has captured Drew's attention, Drew believes he in turn has captured Death's attention, and he becomes all the more frenzied as he tries to invade his inevitable fate. So of course the question is the woman that Drew sees at the hospital really Death, or is there something else going on here? But I shan't go into any more detail as I don't want to spoil anything. But I will say that Mr. Hutchinson always does an excellent job in writing about really intense topics, and this book is no exception. This is a super emotional story about heartbreak, bullying, grief, but also hope and love. Now, the author also did an excellent job in portraying teenagers who had suffered through severe trauma, both in Drew's case and in Rusty's. It's a painful story, the kind that'll break your heart in two throughout the story and then slowly put the pieces of it back together again. I really loved all these characters, and though it broke my heart at times, I ended up loving this book, and I ended up giving it 5 stars. So the next book I read in July was entitled Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. This classic psychological thriller was on my list for quite a while, as I've heard people talk about it actually quite a bit recently for some strange reason. I think I saw the movie starring Joan Fontaine and Laurence Olivier quite a while ago, many years ago, but I really don't remember it at all. So I went in pretty cold to this book. So I actually listened to this on Audible and got the audiobook version of this. And it was about halfway through it when I read an article in Writer's Digest magazine, I do believe. And out of the blue, the author in the article gave away the ending, the twist of Rebecca. I was so pissed. I mean, why would you assume that everybody has read it? Maybe most people have, but maybe it's just me who hasn't. But anyway, there's really no reason to spoil an ending like that. And spoiling that ending really did nothing to move the topic of the magazine forward. But I digress. Anyway, back to Rebecca. As I said, I listened to the audiobook version of this, and it was fantastic. It was narrated by Anna Macy, who was absolutely phenomenal. It sounded as if the story were being told to me by an elegant 1940s movie actress, as she had that kind of voice. I really love Gothic stories like this, and this one had a really Hitchcockian feel to it, which is no surprise given that Hitchcock directed the film version of this story. So our story begins in Monte Carlo, where our heroine, who is a paid personal companion to a rich and domineering woman, Mrs. Van Hopper, meets and is swept off of her feet by a dashing widower whose name is Maxim de Winter. So an alliance develops between her and Mr. de Winter, which leads to a hasty marriage. So the reader then learns, along with our narrator, of de Winter's disturbing past and of his deceased wife, Rebecca. It's only when they arrive at Manderley, de Winter's massive country estate, that the new Mrs. de Winter realizes how large a shadow his late wife casts over their lives. The reminders of the deceased wife, Rebecca, are everywhere. There are personalized note cards still in her desk. There's closets filled with elegant clothes. There's fur coats, monogrammed towels, monogrammed handkerchiefs, and fluffy robes with giant R's in script. The girl becomes increasingly haunted by the accomplished and supposedly stunningly beautiful Rebecca, and more convinces herself that de Winter must have married her on a whim, and most likely still remains hopelessly in love with the perfect Rebecca. She then becomes consumed with finding out as much as she can about Rebecca. In fact, given that, according to her, she is neither very pretty nor worldly wise and is completely out of her element at Manderley, she's terrified that Maxim will eventually come to his senses and realize what a mistake he has made in marrying her and end up leaving her. She's also overwhelmed and intimidated by the sheer size of the house, and given her inexperience, has no idea how to assume her role as the new Mrs. de Winter. And then there's the skeleton-faced housekeeper, Mrs. Danvers, who reinforces the girl's insecurities by continuously pointing out the former Mrs. de Winter's exceptional beauty and elegance, her social skills, her adeptness of managing the household, and her legions upon legions of admirers and friends. Mrs. Danvers, who was Rebecca's personal maid and also a friend, actually ends up being a phenomenal villain and ends up horribly betraying our heroine at some point in the story. So shortly thereafter, the second Mrs. de Winter begins to find out more about Rebecca and the mysterious circumstances surrounding her death. And then there's a new threat which emerges, threatening to destroy her new life and everything she now holds dear. So Rebecca ended up being an intriguing tale of deception, suspense, crime, secrets, with a cast of thoroughly developed and unforgettable characters, all the elements really of a true drama. Now, although the book was first published in 1938. This novel ages exquisitely well, and it didn't feel at all dated to me. So I ended up loving it and giving it 5 stars. So the next book I read in July was entitled The Ghost of Normandy Road by John Hennessy. So this was a novella that I won in a Goodreads drawing and follows Danny, a 10-year-old boy who lives not too far from an infamous haunted house, though he doesn't quite believe the local rumors that the house is evil. Now this is the house that nobody will enter because those who do may never come out again. In fact, most people even avoid walking by the house unless absolutely necessary. So this house is also blaming the disappearances of numerous neighborhood children, though it seems that everybody just pretends that it never happened. So of course, one day Danny dares to enter the house, and as he quickly learns, the house is far from empty. So this book takes 3 local legends. There's the Witch of Hilltop Road, there's the Tooth Fairy with the red wings, and there's the Ghost of Normandy Road, and brings them together in a suspenseful and creepy tale, all told from Danny's 10-year-old point of view. The book also follows a sweet childhood romance between Danny and a little girl named Rebecca, and we experience Danny's emotions as he falls in puppy love with her. They even enter into the dreaded house together. But when his love interest goes missing, this is when things get really interesting in the story, as Danny suspects that the house had something to do with her disappearance. So he takes it upon himself to search for her. This was really a fun little horror story with a huge twist at the ending, which was quite scary in places. Though our protagonist is 10 years old, I don't know if I'd say this was really a child's book or even a middle grade book. There were parts that were quite chilling, and I think that it scared the bejesus out of a 10-year-old, and some adults for that matter. The book did keep me interested until the very end, though I would have liked to have learned a little more backstory behind the surprise ending. I don't know, in a way it felt a little incomplete to me. The book definitely could have been a little bit longer and maybe fleshed out a little more of the details. I also found it a bit disjointed that though we were experiencing the thoughts and emotions of a 10-year-old through his eyes, the language at times was far from that of a child, but rather was more like that of an adult. And the narrative switched, seemingly without warning, from Danny's childlike point of view voice to that mature, more adult one. So though this probably was used as a plot device, I did find it a bit jarring. But regardless, this was a fun read, and I ended up giving it 3.5 stars. So I think I'm going to stop there for now. I will record the rest of my wrap-up in part 2. So I will talk to you in that video. So as always, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate your support. Oh, and if you like this video, I'd really appreciate it if you'd give it a thumbs up as well. Bye-bye.